lot of the details, travel details for a consulting trip are left to my secretary. And when the travel arrangements got communicated to me through 2 or 3 different people, and finally to me, it sounded like I was going to some remote place of Alaska. Well, it was almost like that. I took a jet to Seattle, then I took another jet to Vancouver, and then I had to stay over and got on a seaplane and went 350 miles out into the ocean someplace. And the seaplane landed on a huge body of water, and then I got on a motorboat and took the motorboat into a small fishing village, and that was Bella Bella. And on leaving, I was supposed to take the seaplane out of there, but when the day came for my departure, it started raining like you wouldn't believe, and the winds were very strong, which meant that the daily seaplane from Vancouver was canceled, and I was had just barely enough time to catch the weekly ferry boat out of there, which was a 20-hour boat ride back to Vancouver and then back to California. And I had just enough time to change my clothing and repack and come here. So if I had missed that ferry boat, I'd be on it right now. And George or somebody would be giving this presentation. I don't know, maybe Linda. Some years ago, I worked as a consultant for the Office of Child Development, as a consultant observer in a national evaluation model experiment program called Planned Variation. Maybe some of you heard about it or read about it, or know people that have actually participated in it. It was a 3-year experiment to test out 8 definitive early education models over that 3-year period, and to gather extensive data to see what some of the problems were with the implementation of an innovation, and to see what characteristics of models lend themselves best to implementation, and which models will they have problems implementing those models. And a lot of interesting information came out of that study, but one of the things that they found out was that, aside from many other factors, those systems where the administration not only understood the innovation that was being implemented, but also examined the nature of that innovation to see what implications it may have for a modification of the style of administration. Not only was the implementation much more complete, but when the actual training that took place over the 3-year period by the various modelers ended, that the program continued and thrived. In those instances where the administration was ignorant of the innovation, either deliberately or unwittingly, they undermined it. Teachers understood what was to be done. They tried to implement that with the youngsters, but there were administrative decisions which ran in the face of what they were trying to do, or in some instances were designed to undermine the innovation. So in the formulation of the Anisa-Model many years ago, it was realized that at some point this issue had to be addressed. And in the last few years, we've tried to give serious thought to the implications of that body of theory, the body of philosophy, in a system of administration that would not only not get in the way, but would actually facilitate the purpose of this system of education. Now, I'm here to tell you that really is an enormous undertaking. Because you see, there have been attempts at articulating a theory, comprehensive theory of administration, practically since the turn of the century. And all of the attempts have not been completely successful. What I thought I'd do before sketching out some of the broad characteristics of the Anisa theory of administration is to give you a little historical rundown of those various attempts at generating theory of administration. The earlier attempts, of course, come out of industry. And some of the early work done at the turn of the century really focused on how to improve efficiency, that the primary interest was productivity. And I think you should, even though those attempts had no explicit philosophy, you could examine them and actually induce what the basic philosophy underlying them was. And I think the most important characteristic that emerges in my estimation is that they basically assume that humans were objects, were kind of automatons, instruments to be used in specific ways. And so the emphasis was a mechanistic orientation. Now, those efforts were somewhat successful because what they did was to standardize production processes and whatnot, and the net effect was to increase productivity. But then, after a while, the effects weren't nearly as impressive as they thought they should be. And what they were coming to realize is that when you're dealing with human beings, there are factors that are internal to human beings which have a bearing on how well they function in the job situation. And research coming out of the social sciences was beginning to have implications for refashioning concepts of administration. And so you had a shift from a kind of totally mechanistic, product-oriented orientation to a human relations consideration. And there were the Hawthorne studies where they found that any kind of attention at all had a positive effect, and that people like to have their personal concerns taken into account. The problem there was that in some instances people were feeling very good in their job situation and the relationships were fine. Everybody loved one another, but it didn't necessarily mean that productivity was improved. In some cases productivity decreased, and so that sent everybody back to the drawing boards. And now much of the work from that period to date has attempted to take into consideration both the business of increasing efficiency, but also taking the human being into consideration. Now, if you look through the literature, you see, if you think education is confusing, look into the literature on administration. One of the big problems there is that certain terms are used separately, interchangeably, with definitions shifted back and forth and so on. For example, you have the term management. But if you look at much of the stuff that's written by the American Management Association, it is seen as the overarching category, and they tag elements of leadership and administration as subunits of. But if you look someplace else, leadership is seen as the overarching category or as something entirely separate from management and administration. So the language is terribly confusing. But I think there was the intuition, but in terms of bodies of information about management seems to become more systematized because, well, one reason I think is that there was the intuition that at least management had to do with the day-to-day operations of an enterprise, and so techniques were worked out in a fairly systematized way for providing for that function. But management alone, in terms of that notion, has its limitations. Now, historically, the oldest concept of leadership has to do with the notion of leaders being born, that whoever emerges as a leader is a leader because his genetic or her genetic deck was stacked such that that capacity emerged. But out of the democratic tradition came the notion that leadership had to do with a consideration of a continuum between autocratic and democratic, with our bias being that if the person is more democratic, he's apt to be a better leader than if he's autocratic. And but an agency called the Research Bureau of Business Research at Ohio State began to gather data on individuals who function on that continuum, or looking at their functioning on that continuum from autocratic to democratic. And they clearly dispelled the notion that leadership can be considered on that just that one dimension. They found people who were autocratic that were terribly effective. They found others who were autocratic that were terribly ineffective. They found some who were democratic that were both effective and others who were ineffective. So that sent everybody back to the drawing boards. But out of their efforts there at Ohio State, they emerged the notion that leadership should be conceived in terms of two types of functioning. And the labels that they attach to these two types of functioning are, one, initiating structure, and the second, a term they call consideration. Initiating structure refers to the process of delineating relationships between the leader and those being led, the work group, by establishing well-defined patterns of organization, by clearly delineating channels of communication and methods of procedure. In other words, imposing a structure. And if you want one word that pretty much sums up all of that, a leader who tells people what to do and how to do it and when to do it, and so on. If you want a word to symbolize, or two words to symbolize the consideration aspects, you can use the term human relations. It's a posture of nurturing, assisting, applauding one's efforts, showing warmth, showing friendship. And out of that notion grew what has been termed a managerial grid, where, I guess I better draw that, where the best form of leadership was assumed to be high scores on both of those dimensions. Somebody who's warm, friendly, nurturing, as well as somebody who can give directions, who can be precise, who can tell people what to do, when to do, and so on. According to, up this side of the grid is consideration for people. And they calibrated it from 1 to 9. And along this dimension of the grid was concern for production. And of course it's from 1 to 9. And so...
Mr. Thibodeau, please call the office. Mr. Thibodeau.
So here in this quadrant here, if somebody is 9-1, then they're high in terms of their consideration or concern for production, but they're very low in terms of the concern for human relations. In this quadrant here, they're high in both categories. They're very nurturing, but they're very concerned for the achievement of tasks. Here would be a person up at this extreme would be a 1-9.
Mrs. Harris, please call the office. Mrs. Harris.
Who is not all that concerned for initiating structure or concerned for production, but is very high in terms of human relations. And then down here is the disaster area, which is, in terms of this conceptualization, somebody who really doesn't give a damn about anybody and could care less about production. So they decided that this was the super leader. This is what every leader should be. Down here, if you want a word to characterize this person, this is the taskmaster who's cracking the whip all the time. Up here, the ideal is a team leader, the super administrator. Over here, the party guy, the country club person. Down here, the term that they use to characterize that one is the impoverished. And just as a digression, this quadrant idea is often used to characterize teachers in terms of management skills. The one down here is considered the boot camp type teacher. The one up here, of course, is the super teacher. The one over here is the fuzzy teddy bear type. You know, they call this one the Peace Corps type. Where they love everybody, but they get run over. And the one down here is called the absolute disaster and should be counseled out of the field. Because they're both, you know, low in both respects. Now that all sounded very good, and I think intuitively, when I first heard about that, I said, well, that really makes sense. But guess what? When they gathered extensive data on individuals who exemplified each of these leadership styles, they found out that there was no consistent pattern. So that sent them back to the drawing boards. Two of our colleagues, Paul Hershey and Ken Blanchard, who were involved in much of this research, I think have sorted out the problem here. And basically what they have found and is represented in their model is that there really is based on this assumption that there is no single leadership style that's good for all occasions and all work groups. That there are instances where each of these leadership styles is appropriate and best. And so they introduced what they call the effectiveness dimension, which means that the leadership style has to be patterned after the maturity of the group with whom they're working and with consideration for the complexity of the task or tasks being assigned.
Janice, Frank, stop typing for 5 minutes, please. Janice, Frank.
So let me just give you a little example of how each of these leadership styles may be appropriate in a particular kind of situation with a particular kind of group. The high task, low relationship. Now, low relationship in this instance doesn't mean somebody who's nasty and obstreperous and insensitive. It just means that the person is spending most of his or her time giving structure, giving direction, telling when, what to do, when to do it, how, and whatnot. If you have a group that is new to a particular job, that's relatively immature in that respect, what they really need is not a lot of nurturing. They need somebody to tell them how to do what they're supposed to do. And so you have a leadership style that provides that kind of structure. Now you have the same situation in your classrooms. There are some youngsters who, by virtue of their immaturity, need to be told to sit down, open your book to such and such a page, you're going to be working this kind of lesson, and this is how you do it. And if you wanted to use a word to kind of typify that in terms of their notion, it's telling. You're given directives. In this quadrant here, this would be quadrant 1, this would be quadrant 2. You have a group that's a little bit more mature, but who still need a lot of direction, but also, as they approach what they're doing, they need some nurturing and some friendly treatment. And if you want a word to typify that style of leadership, the word selling is useful. Now, as the group matures, they really don't need all that much direction. What they need is a lot of encouragement and a lot of warmth. And the word that pretty much typifies that style of leadership is participating. They know what they're how to do what they're supposed to do, but they need encouragement. Now down here in quadrant 4 is a very mature group who knows what they're supposed to do and when to do it and how to do it and whatnot, and really basically want to be left alone so that they can carry on their work. And an example of that type of group might be a research group, let's say in a pharmaceutical house. They know they have expertise in the particular area of their designated research, and really what they want the supervisor or the administrator to do is just leave them alone so that they can do it. It doesn't mean that the person is not friendly. It just means that they require far less of that than, let's say, these two quadrants. And they don't need a lot of direction because they know what they're supposed to do. Some, or the authors, Hershey and Blanchard, have also used this quadrant notion to talk about parenting styles. In fact, they have a book out applying this model to parenting. And it's called The Parent Game. Here you have a young child who needs to be told practically everything. Here they need a lot of love, but they also need structure. Over here, they're in the adolescent years. They need benevolent neglect, but reassurance and whatnot. Down here, they're adults. They really need you out of their hair so they can get on with their own lives. I don't necessarily agree with that completely across the board, but I think it's a useful description to understand these different leadership styles. And it doesn't mean that once you're in one quadrant, that's the only kind of style you use with a particular group. Because you see, a group can regress in terms of their maturity. And they have a system for dealing with that. If the group regresses in their maturity, then you back up and you use an earlier leadership style to deal with that until they show evidence that they've regained that maturity and possibly gone beyond it. Now, what does all that have to do with the Anisa approach to administration? The Anisa theory of administration is an attempt to explain the nature of administration. And what Hershey and Blanchard have done is to take one aspect of administration and define in theoretical terms and the application of that theory how to apply the leadership aspect of it. Well, let me just back up and talk about the Anisa theory of administration and then tie it into this. Then I want to put you through an exercise so that you can see what your basic leadership style might be. I mentioned that efforts to fashion a comprehensive theory of administration have not been successful. There have been repeated attempts down through the years. And given that history, it would appear that it's awfully presumptuous of anybody to try to take on something like that. Because just as attempts at articulating a theory of curriculum and a theory of pedagogy have not been all that successful in the past for the same reasons, this may appear to be, quite an enormous, if not impossible, undertaking. But I think the thing that allowed us to break through those barriers with respect to curriculum and teaching is the realization that they are necessarily derivative theories of something much broader. I think the same thing applies with administration. Efforts at articulating a comprehensive theory of administration have focused almost entirely on the behaviors of humans. And what is needed is not just to focus on that, something that goes beyond that, that explains the behavior of humans. Now, if you remember from the various presentations on the model that a great deal of work has been done in generating a body of philosophy that explains the nature of humans as a broad framework. And out of that came a basic proposition that explains development in its broadest ramifications. For example, Whitehead says that the nature of everything can be expressed in the form of the translation of potentiality into actuality. That's what we mean by growth. That's what we mean by development. That everything in creation exemplifies that process. And that in terms of understanding the nature of humans, that one of the basic characteristics that comes out of that philosophy is the understanding that we have two basic capacities. One is represented by the term immanence, which is the capacity to store the past, and which is largely represented in the form of memory. The second is a term called transcendence, which has to do with the ability to go beyond where we are, with an eye to the future. Those capacities are represented in the uniquely human capacity for consciousness. See, we can not only know something, we can know that we know it. And we can know when we don't know something. No other entities in creation have that particular capacity. And that the actualization of potential is represented in terms of those two capacities, the capacity for immanence and the capacity for transcendence. Now, I'm going to tie in with that in just a little bit. The word administration means to serve. The conventional notion of administration means to boss people around. I remember one time when I guess I was a fourth grader, and I was just waiting year by year until I could become a patrol boy. And I thought, boy, when I get that badge, when I get that belt, I can tell the kids what to do. And I put the belt on when I became a patrol boy, and the first kid came along, and I gave him an order, and he ignored it. See, I thought of that function as being one of bossing people around. But it's interesting that the word to administer means to serve. Now the question comes, to serve what? And the purpose of administration is to serve the purpose of the enterprise. Now, if you accept the notion that education has to do with the translation of potentiality into actuality through helping kids to become competent learners, then the function of administration is to mobilize all of the resources of the enterprise towards the accomplishment of that purpose, and to do it as efficiently as possible. One of the things that has to be done in terms of that function is to accumulate the experience of the system of the past, to bring it to bear on the present while providing for or foreseeing its future. Now, if you take the concept of immanence as it applies to the individual human being and apply that to a business system or an educational enterprise, what do you have? You have the collective history, which is represented in the form of policies, managerial procedures, routines, which have to do with the management of the day-to-day operations. But then, presumably, that enterprise is headed in some direction. It's going beyond where it is at any given time. Therefore, it has its own transcendence, or it should have. If it doesn't, it's in trouble. So that out of those two notions of immanence and transcendence comes the concepts of management and leadership. Administration, in this sense, is viewed as the superordinate category or the overarching category with the subunits of management and leadership. Management means, in this sense, utilizing the immanence of the system, which is the cumulative experience of the institution, to achieve its purpose. Leadership has to do with shaping the actions in terms of what the system might become in the future, thereby guaranteeing that the system releases its potentialities. Now, for any system to survive, it has to strike a balance between these two functions. Whitehead calls it permanence, to be management, flux, which has to do with leadership. You can think of it in terms of stability on the one hand and change on the other. Management has to do with maintaining the continuity of the effort and maintaining the stability of the effort. And leadership has to do with the introduction of novelty or change so that it can pursue its, the accomplishment of its destiny. If you exercise one function at the expense of the other, there are going to be problems. Admitting that at any point in time, there will be greater implications for one than the other. If you, some of you may have read an interesting article by Robert Havighurst, who did an analysis of various leadership styles to generate an idea of what type might be most appropriate for this time in education. And one of the styles that he talked about, he referred to as the prophetic gadfly. And you see, the prophetic gadfly is the one who's more of a leader in terms of this definition than a manager. Somebody who can spin beautiful visions of future possibilities and mobilize energies and inspire hope and so on. But they're lousy managers, and so nothing's consolidated. So hopes are stimulated, dreams are inspired, and there's no deliverance. Now, if there's anything worse than the low morale that comes from no vision, it's when there are promises that are unfulfilled. At the other end of the continuum is the shopkeeper, who merely manages the day-to-day operation. That becomes terribly boring. And you see, it's a violation of a basic ontological principle, namely that everything is in the process of change, even this table. And certainly conditions out there are changing, and certainly schools have to change. And if they don't change, in fact, according to Whitehead, if something stops changing, it's dead. But the reality of anything adheres in its process of becoming. That applies to institutions as well as to individuals. The word leadership means to draw out. It means to lead forth. And of course, this presumes that, that the leader is out front and that somebody's following. You don't have leadership if nobody's following. And it also presumes that they're being led in some direction. Now, the direction is determined by the purpose with the attendant objectives. The function of leadership, therefore, is to articulate purpose with such lucidity that a vision of a future state is painted clearly, and that everybody understands that. If the purpose is explained and held alive with lucidity, then perspective can be attained. When perspective is attained, then you have a basis for determining relevance. If you know, if relevance is established, then you have a basis for determining priorities and for the allocation of resources. When you have relevance, When you have perspective, when you have a sense of purpose, you have a basis then for making decisions. When that obtains, arbitrariness can be taken out of the decision-making process because there is a clear rationale for the decisions that are made. And even in a time of economic slump or squeeze, if the rationale is sound and tied in with purpose, people can live with the decisions. It's only when you feel that decisions are being made arbitrarily or politically that people get upset. You see, clarity of rationale tied in with purpose establishes the grounds for the acceptability of the decisions. And when there are legitimate grounds for the decisions, then there's a willingness to comply. When there's a willingness to comply, then people are hopeful. And that seems to be the best situation because morale then runs high if people have a sense of hope. Those systems which are characterized entirely by management become a kind of dull routine. It presumes that everything's going to stay the same, and people who are part of it then become more concerned about the materialistic aspects of the job. They're concerned with fringe benefits, with hours, with overtime, with wages, and so on. Not that those shouldn't be of concern, but they tend to predominate over the more transcendent things. Now, that represents a kind of broad skeletal outline of how the Anisa theory of administration has been derived from basic notions of the Anisa philosophy and the theory of development. So it's the articulation of a concept of administration. Where Blanchard and Hershey's work come into that, I think, is that in terms of the leadership function, the style of leadership will determine to what extent the person who's exercising the leadership function is effective. And if you have a singular style, then you can almost be sure, based on the data that's been gathered to date, that you're going to be ineffective to some extent. Now, teachers are leaders. Most teacher groups that I talk to are kind of shocked when that's said, but you really are leaders. You're a leader to the youngsters. You're a leader in the school. You're a leader when you're working with the parents and community groups. And so part of the individualization of instruction has to do with not only being able to understand child development and prescribe learning experiences based on their level of development, but to also demonstrate a style of teaching which takes into consideration what's appropriate in terms of the maturity of the given youngster or group of youngsters that you're working with. Now, what I'd like to do at this point is to have you react to 12 situations represented in these forms that I'm going to pass out, and you pick what you would consider, based on this, the most appropriate leadership style to addressing those situations. After you've completed that, the other two forms, I'll explain to you how you score your responses, and that will give you a perspective on the kind of leadership style, on your flexibility to modify your style according to the situation. And so let's just see how that comes out. Would somebody help me passing these out?
Each one gets one.
Each one gets one. Think you would respond in that situation. Now, when you are in the actual situation, intuitive and all sorts of other things will come into play, and there will be more details to respond to than can be represented in a little anecdotal statement here. So don't, if you've got a negative score or a 0 score or a very weakly positive score, don't be cast into a state of depression. The other thing is that there are other materials from this, the works of Blanchard and Hershey that I think are terribly useful, and that is where you, with a group of colleagues, take on an actual situation, and then they rate you and themselves. They rate themselves in terms of the level of maturity with which they approach the particular task. Then they rate you in terms of the appropriateness of the style that you used in dealing with them, in handling that issue. And I think that's terribly useful feedback. Sometimes groups have gotten together on their own and actually discussed each of these situations and why the particular response was felt to be the most appropriate one, most appropriate leadership style for that response. Situations call for different things in terms of teachers. Which style do you think, which one of these quadrant styles would you use if the fire alarm went off? It'll line up, no talking, move. I mean, you become a fascist, right? And it's legitimately so. I mean, you're not going to sit down and either take this or you know, do a lot of nurturing. And I know you really don't want to go out in the cold, but gee, I wish you would consider it. You know, in the meantime, some of you may have been in, for example, administrative meetings or been involved in the decision-making process when the nature of the problem was such that there was only one thing you could do. Well, not to be engaged in the participatory process when it's obvious what the only solution is, I mean, you begin to resent that. It's kind of a phony democracy. On the other hand, there are situations when you have a very mature group who ought to be participating or being delegated, well, the term here should be delegating, being delegated tremendous amounts of responsibility. And if they're not, then there are problems there. Do you have any questions? Well, I'm going to be here. Oh, one other thing, and that is that Ken Blanchard is going to be working with some of the administrators this summer, and basically coming from this theoretical model and discussing the whole issue of how leadership should pattern itself after the situation and the maturity of the individuals being worked with. So that I think you should know that has already is being provided for in the extension of this project. Do you have anything more to say about that, George?
Yeah, let me say two other things. As Dr. Streets was indicating, for a change process or an innovation to take place, the key people are the administrators, whether they're for it or not for it. Very important. Many administrators have been attending the sessions, and we've had some orientations for all of the administrators. We do plan to run a 3-day, full-day workshop this summer with hopefully all of the administrators, at least those who are not going to be on vacation. That includes the superintendents, principals, the directors of pupil services, and so forth. And we hope to have Dr. Blanchard out. I have a commitment to that. Let me say, Dr. Blanchard and Paul Hershey, their daily rate in industry is $3,000 a day. That's what IBM and Xerox is willing to pay. Well, we're pulling some strings and some friendship and some other things to try to get them out this summer. But it is important for our administrators to understand this theory, and it's not just Anisa. I think it has a broader implication across the board, but it is clearly consistent and congenial. One other thing while I have you here. Here is an an evaluation maturity rating scale. Now, with our staff, the center staff, the model of evaluation that we're using right now by state is built on this model. I'm asking each person to take their position guide where their major responsibilities are spelled out. And they list those major responsibilities. Then I'll be asking each of you then for those responsibilities to make a judgment on an 8-point scale. And there are two dimensions here. One dimension is job maturity. Job maturity is, do you have the ability? And the other is what we call psychological maturity. Do you have the motivation? We have a lot of people who are highly motivated but don't have the confidence, and we have it the other way around. Then what I'll be asking our staff to do is to rate themselves on each of these job responsibilities on an 8-point scale. For example, past job experience. Has experience relevant to the job, does not have experience. Ability to take responsibility, can be left alone, needs close supervision. Meeting job deadlines, always meets deadlines, never finishes a job. Then on the other maturity, the psychological maturity, willingness to take responsibility, is very eager, is very reluctant. Persistence, won't quit until done, gives up easily. Asking each staff member then to judge themselves on these. And they'll work out what would be the appropriate leadership style that we would then negotiate. In other words, in some of these dimensions, the person may be, Julie, if you don't mind, I can use you. Diagnostically, Julie was doing very well. Julie's leaving us now at the end of this month. She's finished her internship with us, and she has a position as a school psychologist in the Simsbury School. So I had to get an evaluation, and she's been the first guinea pig here, so I'm referring to it. For example, diagnostically, Julie, we were in basic agreement that you were quite job mature and highly motivated and so forth. But in terms of casework, which is a new area, she was relatively low and then would need a fairly high structure. Now, what we do here is the staff member works out on each of these dimensions what their task maturity level would be. And then we determine what would be the appropriate style. And here's where we negotiate. In other words, you may disagree that you need high structure. I might feel that I really have to structure. This is what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it. You may say, really, I think I'm more mature there, and this would be the style. So we're translating some of this into practice already, and I'm taking this opportunity with a captive audience. It saves me another hour.
Okay, I guess we'll take a break now.
When these have been filled out, then we'll invite you for a little snack across the way. Thank you.
That is, I'm going to take an approach this evening in looking at the Anisa-Model as a scientific theory. And I'm going to really get way high, take a look at the whole forest, and not only a cluster of trees. So I want to get that broad perspective. There was a question that dominated my graduate training, and it's still a guide. Let me just raise